So my name is Michael O'Kane, and tonight's talk with Dr. Corey Wrenn is why humanists should care about animal rights. Before introducing you to our guest, some small observations on the format of our talk this evening. We've just commenced recording of the event, and with Dr. Wrenn's permission, we will share that on our social media afterwards. I will take note of and monitor questions on our chat, so do feel free to add questions in that format if you don't want to speak later on, and we will read out the questions for Corey to listen to and engage on. So we won't be reading out the questions as the presentation is happening. And if you do want to speak, the format is to raise the hand function on your Zoom, where we'll grant audio access, and then you have the ability to speak and say hi. And please be respectful and mindful of our speaker and our audience and the presentation. The presentation with and talk and questions and answers should go on till about 8:25, 8:30, and if we feel we'd like to go on a little bit more, we'll ask Corey her permission on that. And before we get into connecting with Corey, a little bit on what is humanism. Humanism is a simple philosophy. It is an ethical life stance which focuses on human values, being good without God. It is about taking responsibility and treating others with respect while living our one life. If you'd like to know more or have a more in-depth description, the statement of the fundamental principles of modern humanism, otherwise known as the Amsterdam Declaration, is available online. And you may also want to go to our own website here in Ireland, humanism.ie. Our guest this evening, Dr. Corey Wrenn, is a lecturer of sociology with the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research at the University of Kent, and co-director of the Centre for the Study of Social and Political Movements. She was awarded Exemplary Diversity Scholar 2016 by the University of Michigan's National Center for Institutional Diversity. She served as council member with the American Sociological Association's Animals and Society section in 2013 to 2016, and was elected chair in 2018, and is co-founder of the International Association of Vegan Sociologists. She serves as a book review editor to Society and Animals and is a member of the Vegan Society's Research Advisory Committee. Dr. Wrenn has been published in several peer-reviewed academic journals, including the Journal of Gender Studies, Feminist Media Studies, Environmental Values, Disability and Society, Food, Culture and Society and Animals. In July 2013, and if that wasn't enough, she founded the Vegan Feminist Network, an academic activist project engaging intersectional social justice praxis. She is the author of A Rational Approach to Animal Rights, Extension and Abolition of Theory, Piecemeal Protest, Animal Rights in the Age of Non-Profits, and Animals in Irish Society. Hello, Corey, and great to have you this evening, all the way from, I believe, Kent, not Cork.
Correct, yes. I'm in Canterbury, England.
Excellent. A beautiful part of the world. So again, thank you so much for joining. We're really delighted and excited about this evening. I know you have a presentation that you've been kind to prepare. I do have it on standby in case any technology gremlins appear on your side. But if you're happy to begin, we are happy to hear everything.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Wow, it builds up my self-esteem a little bit to hear someone read it out. And thanks very much for having me for a topic that may I go out on a limb and assume that a lot of you may have not really thought a lot about. So I'm very, very excited to have the opportunity to discuss my life's passion, which is advocating animal rights. So let me share the screen. How's that? that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Alrighty, okay.
Excellent. Looks great.
Move that out of the way. All right. So I have a few objectives in this, trying to keep in mind the audience here, assuming that a lot of you may have not really thought very much about animal rights. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk about what animal rights are, how it's kind of generally understood. And then I want to talk about how I think that this project, this animal rights project, has a lot of intersections with humanism and atheism. And sometimes I use those interchangeably just because I identify as an atheist, but hopefully you bear with me with the terminology there. I also want to talk about some critical failures that I see with the humanist rational thinking community, and even in the animal rights community as well. I think that there's a lot of opportunities for intersections that unfortunately have yet to be grasped. So we'll talk about that towards the end. And then some relevant trends that I think that you might find interesting. A lot of this is based on my ongoing research. And although, yes, I've got the American accent, I'm living in England. I have spent quite a lot of time in Cork. I actually lived there for a little while, for about 1.5 years, and recently have published a book on animal rights in Ireland. So a little bit of that will creep in here as well. So hopefully this will be more topical than my usual talk would be. Okay, so who am I? As you heard from my very long-winded, embarrassingly so, introduction there, I'm very much so all around anything to do with animal rights, academically and professionally. I can't get enough of it. I specialize in animal rights theory. I specialize in vegan studies. I do feminist stuff as well. I'm trained as a social movement scholar. So I'm really interested in social justice for non-human animals, and also how we can build bridges to other related movements. And I've also been a lifelong atheist. And I have, in fact, dabbled in the new atheist movement some 10, 15 years ago. This lecture will show you why I kind of backed away from that, which is another reason why I'm very, very excited to have this opportunity to speak with Humanist Association of Ireland, because historically this has been, not this particular organization, but the movement itself has been quite closed off to topics of animal rights. So although I have been an atheist from the day I was born, it was never religious. I was never raised with religion. I didn't even know that there was a social movement associated with it. But so I just came in it as a person who just I don't know much about religion. I didn't get it. And then the older I got, I realized, okay, there's this whole body of work about understanding religion and pushing back against religion. So that's just where I'm coming from. I've been a vegan for 22 years. So there's me with my cat and dog when I questionable hair choices. I was a teenager there. So animals have always been a major part of my life. So has atheism. My family is atheists, but we weren't like outspoken atheists. We just didn't believe, and it wasn't really a thing that we talked about. So yeah, that's my background. That's where I'm coming from. And again, yes, animal rights first, and then sort of atheism when I got into my 20s, as far as the social justice aspect of it. And I'm really pleased that now that I'm pushing 40, it seems like there's a new opportunity to address these intersections. So what are animal rights? So this is a huge, huge complex philosophy, social movement. I think when we say animal rights, it's just kind of an easy term to encompass what is infinitely complex and highly debated, and different people will have different ideas of what that means. But basically this idea that the human rights and individualistic sort of approach to human rights that came out of the turn of the 20th century, the late 19th century, as we modernize and industrialize. At that time, a lot of animal rights people who were interested in what happened to other animals thought that it would be a logical extension to put that towards non-human animals. So for instance, a lot of the early abolitionists were also practicing animal welfare, trying to put into place policy for that. A lot of women who were suffragettes here in the UK, but also in Ireland and also in the United States, were also very, very deeply active in animal rights work as well. So people at the time when this human rights project was really being developed at the turn of the 20th century, people were making that logical connection that also non-human animals matter here. So a lot of this is based on reason. A lot of this is based on science, kind of this idea that non-human animals have sentience, that they are aware, that they care about what happens to them. And again, applying what we apply to human beings to other animals and saying, well, if animals can suffer, if animals are self-aware, if animals are sentient, just like human animals, then it would be logical then to move forward that same respect to other species and include them in our moral circle of concern. So yeah, different philosophers or legal scholars will have different approaches about how we determine who counts and who doesn't. Peter Singer, a very famous philosopher who does animal ethics, but a lot of moral ethics in general, he's argued that it's the capacity to suffer. And so he will say that our moral duty is to reduce that suffering wherever possible. Sometimes he extends that to say that we should be vegetarian or vegan. Tom Reagan, an American philosopher who's no longer with us, he actually comes at the perspective, kind of coming out of environmental ethics and saying that if an animal is a subject of life, irrespective of how we place value on other animals, they have a right to exist, and they have a right to be left alone, or they have a right to thrive. Then you have folks coming from legal scholars, the legal studies field, and they would use the legal terminology. Sorry, my dog and cat are getting riled up. Sorry, guys. The cat's under the couch, if you can see. But Lee Hall, for instance, what uses legal terminology and say, well, we can use the same legal framework we use to protect human rights and apply that to non-human animals and recognize them as persons. So oftentimes in animal rights language, we do refer to non-human animals as persons, as individuals. And that's what makes animal rights unique, in that it's emphasizing individuals, not just species as environmental ethics might, but individuals who are sentient, self-aware, and have an interest in what happens to them. So this is also something that's more systemic. It's not just about individuals. As a sociologist, for instance, I'm very interested in how we have structured our society around the systemic discrimination against other animals. And oftentimes we're looking at how that is rooted in the economy. So I'm going to mention Ireland here in a few slides, and I think very much so the story of speciesism in Ireland is tied to a history of colonialism and economic exploitation there. So it's more than just focusing on individual rights. We're also looking at a system change that is necessary, because the system that we live in now is designed to be human privileging. It's very hierarchical. Some animals get a little bit more rights and recognition than others, but most animals are far lower on this in the hierarchy of moral worth. And very much so, that's a system that's designed to privilege humans. Sometimes folks look at this and say, well, how do we solve this? Well, this just means treat animals nicer. Let's improve their welfare. Let's make sure that they have clean water or bigger cages or access to outdoors. Some folks like myself would say, if we truly respect non-human animals as individuals who are sentient and they care about what happens to them, well, they have an interest in not being killed, eaten, worn, used for entertainment, etc. And so this would actually require total liberation. We can get into like the finer points of what total liberation might look like in the Q&A, but just in general, this idea that we would see a society where non-human animals would not be brought into existence for us to use, which is the vast majority of experiences for non-human animals on the planet. So indeed, this is going to call for a complete social restructuring. If we're looking at total liberation, this is that we just can't tweak the system to make it a little bit nicer for other animals. It's going to have to dramatically change the way we make a living as humans and how we interact with other animals. So this is a major change that, of course, is going to take centuries of work. And we can look at similar social justice movements like with feminism or anti-racism, and those are very much so still projects in the works. So, but that's the thing that we're looking for with non-human animals as well, to completely destroy this idea of human privilege and human entitlement to other animals. And part of that means we have to dramatically change our consumption, because the vast majority of animal suffering is locked into those consumption patterns, human consumption patterns. Most of that is eating their flesh or drinking their breast milk or eating their eggs. But a lot of it also is wearing their skin, buying them from pet stores, et cetera, go visiting zoos, all those types of consumption. So when I look at this as a sociologist, I think that many of us look at animal rights, the issue of animal rights, as being a very economic one. As I just mentioned, it's about how the things we produce and the things that we consume, non-human animals being objectified, turned into consumable items. But also we could look at other structures within our society as being very important for normalizing systemic speciesism. And religion is certainly that. So we definitely know with capitalism that capitalism has ramped up animal exploitation. The modernized food system has now dramatically increased the amount of animal products that we consume on a day-to-day basis. But before capitalism, animal suffering was surely there. And so with institutionalized religion, we have seen that non-human animals have constituted time and time again one of the most vulnerable and oppressed groups, religions across the world. This is not just one religion, this is religions across the world. So for instance, I have this image here of a lamb who's being sent for live export. And this is something that happens here in the UK. I think it also happens in Ireland. It happens in Australia, where animals who are spent from like the wool industry or other animals from other meat industries will also be sent over for use in religious slaughter. And before they even get to their destination where they'll be handled and then slaughtered, the live export system itself is one of the most horrific experiences. Not only just the conditions that happen where these animals are crammed into these ships with no fresh air, no clean water, they're overheating or they're freezing, but oftentimes there'll be accidents where these animals will be stranded. When COVID happened, there was boats that weren't allowed to dock and the animals starved to death or dehydrated to death on these ships. So this is a horrific thing that I like to point out this because this is something that's part of the Western food system that's actually tied into religious practices elsewhere in the world, but it's also very important because it links us to these various religious practices. I don't want to say that this is about what happens over there, because this is something that also happens. This is something that in Western societies we're also responsible for. And as an American, I can tell you last week, Thanksgiving, something like 40 million turkeys are killed every holiday season. And for Christmas time, another religious holiday. So in the West as well, tons and tons of animals are sacrificed for these spiritual practices. And it's extremely ironic, of course, because religions kind of their shtick is it's about preaching for love, compassion, caring about one another, taking care of one another. So on one hand, that's the core of many of these religions, well, all religions really. But then on the other hand, another pattern we see with religion is it's about subservience, sacrifice. So animal sacrifices, as I just mentioned, it's not just something that happens in, say, Islam or Judaism. This is something that happens also in Christian practices. And in fact, it also happens with even pagan religions. So I think one of the kind of, especially we're looking at in Ireland, Ireland has a rich history of various pagan religions. But we look at those, those are more nature-based, so they're less hierarchical, they celebrate women's power. But even looking at those, I'm actually writing a book on this because I think it's a frustrating pattern that most people kind of gloss over. There's a lot of animal use and a lot of glorification and romanticization of animal exploitation in even women's traditions, witchcraft, Wiccan or Wicca, and paganism, and so on and so forth. So it's this whole idea that humans are supposed to be practicing care and compassion, but there's also this element of sacrifice. Even if it's a nature-based sacrifice, non-human animals, their bodies will be used and sometimes will actually be killed, not just consumed, but actually just killed for ritual sacrifices. So I think that this is an area in animal rights that certainly needs our attention. So where's humanism in all of this? So if we're talking about compassion and social justice and pushing back on how religion sort of corrupts that, then we need to be thinking about what happens to non-human animals, because there is systemic level violence that's happened to them in the name of all sorts of religions across the world. Unfortunately, humanism, as the name kind of suggests, tends to be quite anthropocentric. And again, at the start of the talk, I said humanism, but I sometimes switch over and talk about rational thinking or atheism, but it's the same deal with those practices as well. They tend to be extremely anthropocentric. And this is weird to me because part of the idea of pushing back on religion is like, okay, let's not kind of bow down to some supernatural sort of guidance. Let's look to the natural world to do that. Well, we live amongst non-human animals when we're looking at the natural world, and yet we have our blinders on when it comes to other sentient beings who share our world, who are in our society, sometimes even share our beds with us. In my case of my dog and my cat, we all pile up together in the bed. And so people who are practicing atheism and humanism and kind of advocating for social justice sometimes can't even look in front of them and see, oh, these are sentient beings that I share in this natural world as well, and they matter. So it's about social justice and liberty for all individuals. In humanism, I think we need to advance that and include non-human animals as well. So I pulled up some of the mission statements from a few humanist organizations, I think just a couple actually, just to show you what actually is in the kind of the mission here, and how there's room to include non-human animals, although sometimes the language, I think, unnecessarily excludes. So this is coming from the Humanists, of course, like the big magazine. And here you see I've put in bold some of the things I think are very relevant. Informed by science. So if we're informed by science, well, we know that the biological shared capacities we have with other animals. If we're motivated by compassion, why can't we extend that compassion to non-human animals? If it's about individual liberty, well, the greatest form of bondage on earth is what we're doing to non-human animals. Billions of animals across the globe in feedlots and zoos, aquariums, and slaughterhouses. These non-human animals also would serve, would benefit from this idea of individual liberty. I love this here, being consonant with social and planetary responsibility. If we take that seriously, we need to think about eating a plant-based diet, even going vegan, because planetary responsibility cannot really be taken seriously if we're continuing to eat non-human animal products, being one of the major contributors to climate change and all sorts of horrible environmental problems. Social justice, humans being a part of nature, but then you also see down towards the bottom, human experience, human need. And unfortunately, I think that's the type of language that unnecessarily excludes non-human animals, although the wider kind of idea of humanism certainly would easily include non-human animals. There's these little caveats in there that are creating a sense of anthropocentrism. And indeed, as I've said, why I dipped out of the atheist movement 15 years ago is because although the structure was here to truly practice meaningful social justice, when it came down to it, the human privilege kind of locked in, clicked in, and people didn't have time. They did not have the space to talk about animal rights or even veganism. So here's the Humanist Association of Ireland. Ha ha ha. Went on the website to see what was up here as well. And here again, this belief in humanity. Well, this isn't necessarily excluding. This is an ethical belief in humanity doing good without some supernatural kind of guidance to make sure we do it or do it on our behalf. Why can't we, as humans, with the great privilege we have, extend that to helping non-human animals? But again, a commitment to human values. Some of this language sort of starts to exclude, and non-human animals sort of get washed away in this. And when they're such a highly vulnerable group, I do think it's a bit problematic when they're invisibilized in this way, when they're kind of made abstract and an absent referent almost when we're looking at this language of evidence of the natural world. And this is another thing I highlighted here, this notion of tradition, because I think that also is a major reason why humanism has historically not been so inclusive, because like a lot of social movements or like a lot of belief systems or ethical practices, they do kind of get into a pathway of least resistance, and it kind of gets cemented. And sometimes the ability to really think critically about things that have been in place for a long time gets lost. So I think that we need to be challenging traditions that are problematic with religion, but also challenging traditions in humanism that have been stubbornly sticking around and really standing in the way of really meaningfully practicing social justice. So yeah, if it's about justice, reason, and compassion, it's time to include non-human animals. And just a warning, my cat has just creeped underneath. If my webcam goes flying, that's why. I think, again, I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe why humanism in Ireland may have a particular level of resistance. So, I mean, Ireland is unique, of course, because it's a historically Catholic society, but I think it's also, for the purposes of animal rights, unique in that it is very much so an animal agriculturally based society, much more so than a lot of countries. So we're kind of dealing with a double-edged or double whammy, rather, when we're looking at animal rights inclusive humanism in Ireland. You're dealing with the power of the Catholic Church and the power of Irish butter, Irish beef, Irish mutton, and all the other kind of celebrated Irish animal products. I've looked into this, by the way, this legacy of colonialism in Ireland, and I think that has created a sort of resistance to, or even maybe even just an anxiety about a potentially more animal rights inclusive Irish society. So historically, Ireland, of course, was colonized for many hundreds of years, and inevitably that was premised on expanding animal agriculture. So Ireland was basically an outsourced feedlot for England or Great Britain. So a lot of that colonial expansion was about moving people off of their land and making way for more pasturage to make more dairy and to make more meat. And a lot of that would then be exported back into industrializing Britain, or even into the transatlantic slave trade to fund that horrific system that was happening in the Caribbean. So from the beginning of this colonial kind of horror was all about moving people out of the way to make room for meat and dairy production. That is really essential, I think, to the story of Ireland, and we need to be thinking about that. And perhaps is one of the reasons why we should think about how humanism is relevant, or how animal rights and humanism are relevant here, but maybe how they haven't been, because people, it's a unfortunate sort of not nice thing to think about. So I've definitely seen in a lot of talks of veganism in Ireland that a lot of this kind of anxiety or kind of trauma that's associated with famines and multiple famines, right? And just the colonial sort of humiliation and violence that went along with all that. There's a real hesitancy to talk about these issues. But that's a shame, because actually historically, pre-colonial Ireland ate a very plant-based diet, not vegetarian fully, but very close to vegetarian, like a lot of traditional societies. Early Celtic and pre-Celtic cultures practiced animism and saw non-human animals not as others, but as community members almost. There was a lot of worship of non-human animals as well, and the ability to turn into animals and vice versa. So many legacies from those early legends about non-human animals being a big part of society. Cattle economy as well. So like I said, they definitely weren't vegan. They weren't fully vegetarian, but they're very plant-based. So cattle were was a very important part of early Irish society, and it's still imbued in the language today, the place names, and even the landscape. Even the ability for Irish people to digest dairy, when most people in the world can't, and definitely couldn't then, shows that animals were a major part of Irish society. And by the way, cows are much more important to be alive to produce dairy and to be used as currency than be killed and eaten as meat. So I think that before colonialism, there really was this history of a more respectful relationship with other animals. But after colonialism, of course, speciesism became institutionalized. And that rich, very rich, diverse Gaelic kind of pre-colonial vegetarian diet, or mostly vegetarian diet, had been replaced with a very precarious diet of colonial vegetarianism, which was like just cabbage, potatoes, maybe a little milk if you're lucky. And you can look at some of the food logs in poorhouses during famine times and see it was a diet of paucity. And there's high food insecurity, of course, which is one of the reasons we had the Great Famine in the 1840s. And people had no land, and so created more precarity for folks. So non-human animals have been really essential to the story of Ireland, and I think very essential to understanding why humanism may or may not be willing to engage with non-human animals respectfully. And then also, some of you are probably aware, Irish people have been animalized themselves. And then we see a similar thing happening in the United States with Black folks who've historically been animalized. And so they've been very hesitant to get on board with the animal rights movement because, well, they're still actually being considered, being talked about as though they're apes. And that's the same thing that happened with Irish people. In the 1800s in the United States and in the United Kingdom, Irish people were considered ape-like, not fully human, a subspecies of humans. And so that legacy, again, could be relevant to understanding why humanism may or may not be willing to take animal rights seriously, or just Irish society in general. And then even when Ireland went independent, that was a very, very precarious time. When a post-colonial country is on it for the first time on their own, there was a lot of talk. A lot of those nationalists at the time were they recognized that non-human animals and animal agriculture has been so important to the degradation of Irish society. But there was a lot of people also like, this is all we know how to do now. And so there was like a doubling down on agrarianism after Ireland went independent. And that kind of celebration of how farmers got Ireland through independence, I think it's another form of resistance to thinking about animal rights today. It's very difficult to criticize anything about Irish farming. You just look like the most unpatriotic person to do that.
Corey, if I
So,
may just come in quickly, you mentioned something I looked at about free nationalism, that as a society we were a little bit more radical around animal rights, but then a curtain of conservatism came over the country. Could you explain that a little bit? It's really fascinating what, that curtain of conservatism you felt came along at that time. Why was that?
yeah, so like I said, there was a lot of debate. In fact, the proclamation was signed in a vegetarian restaurant. It was Jenny Wise Power was her name, and she ran a vegetarian restaurant in Dublin. And they had so many nationalist meetings in there that actually they were under surveillance of the British government. But yeah, the proclamation was signed in a vegetarian restaurant. And there was folks who recognized that the food, this now British kind of anglicized food system was also weakening Irish people. This is not a healthy vegetarian diet. This was processed foods, just a lot of milk and potatoes, not very nutritionally varied. Some people also, if you look at some of the vegetarian societies meetings at that time, they were advocating, saying this is why Ireland is suffering right now, because there's no land. All the land has been taken up by beef and dairy cattle. So people were a lot of people recognize that this is problematic. However, I think this is the case we see over and over again with the transition out of colonialism, is that these countries have been set into place with these pathways, these economic pathways for so long. It's difficult to innovate. And of course, when you become independent, now you're really on your own, and they're oftentimes in very politically unstable situations, as Ireland certainly was. There's a matter of resources and a real interest in making a claim in the world economy. So Ireland, places like India is another good example, actually really dug down deep after they went independent on these animal foodways. Like for instance, it became a nationalist cause in India to produce more and more and more milk. That became their thing. And these are foodways that, of course, like people in Ireland and people in India consumed milk before, but not at the levels and not with such an extreme taking over the landscape like it happened when the British folks came in and colonized. So there was this reluctance there because they realized that this is probably the only thing that they've known. But then also, like I said, that there's also this notion that Irish farmers got us through that very, very tough time. Of course, in the first couple of decades after independence, there was a much more insular society. And of course, we saw that was doubling down with the Catholicism as well. So we definitely see an intersection there with like a doubling down on that speciesism, a doubling down on this religiosity. And it really did take a few decades of kind of unpeeling that to start to think critically about that, because you did not criticize the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church got us through those tough times. You do not criticize animal agriculture. That sustained us through these tough times.
Yeah, and you talked about it being sort of Marianistic, right? Kind of Mother Ireland and Brand Ireland being the farming society.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. I'd like to put more Irish stuff in here. Thanks. So I guess let's come back to humanism then, and I want to kind of highlight a little bit of my research here. This is actually this is a study that I did about American atheists that I did by accident. I was very, very shocked during the rise of Donald Trump in the United States. I was living in America at the time, and I saw some kind of resistance in the animal rights kind of social media about some of these liberal ideas about talking about race or gender in our animal rights. And we can come back to this about how I also wonder like why atheism isn't talked about in animal rights, but it's kind of this reluctance to be intersectional. So I did a survey of 300 American vegans, and yeah, there's about 10% of my sample came back as like Trump supporters. Like, what? Okay. But the unexpected thing that came out of that, I just happened to ask people, what is your religion? And 3/4 of my respondents reported that they were atheist or agnostic. So I think most of them, about 50%, were actually atheist. What? So I was really blown away by that. I was like, this is a clear connection. So this kind of validated me when I said 15 years ago, I tried to get into the new atheist movement and say, why aren't we extending these values and including non-human animals? Well, here we are in the animal rights movement. We don't really talk about atheism. And yet most of us are atheists. What's going on here? So we have a major majority in the animal rights movement, and yet historically, the atheist humanist community has really been unwilling to talk about this, about non-human animals and the concept of animal rights. And I think this is bizarre. Again, so I'm going to show you some examples from the new atheist movement about how we kind of get there, but it's not quite. So Christopher Hitchens, I love this. This is an op-ed where he says, "We're not so docile sheep." And so a lot of times, we have this criticism where it's, I guess, in Christianity, like we're supposed to be obedient sheep, Christ is our shepherd or whatever. And if people are being described as obedient sheep, and of course, in a pejorative way from the new atheist movement, I wonder then, what about sheep themselves? If people who are being kind of brainwashed by religion and like guiding their whole life by this institution, they're being sent to this kind of metaphorical slaughter. What about actual sheep who are actually being slaughtered, actually being harmed, physically losing their lives because of religion? So I think that we use them metaphorically in this way, and then they become an absent referent. We refer to them, but they're not actually present in our thinking in the atheist and humanist community. And then sometimes we just have just bizarre science. Like this is one of the things we pride ourselves in: science, right? Reason thinking, using evidence to make decisions about our bodies and our lives. And then you have people like Darren Brown, who's a very famous skeptic in the UK, who got on board with a bunch of milk ads. Milk ads. So he's talking about facts. And of course, he's the spokesperson for science and evidence-based thinking. And here he is promoting this extremely unhealthy and highly unethical product. So he's talking about powerful stuff in the white stuff. And I've written a whole article about this, by the way, the white stuff you see down here at the bottom. But the white stuff for who? The global majority cannot digest lactose. That's a very white sort of unique thing for white people. So when they're talking about the white stuff, they're talking about white stuff for white people. So this type of this kind of colonization of our nutritional kind of know-how by who? The dairy industry and governments that support that is sort of a two-way thing. And so then you have people in the global majority, people who are people of color, indigenous people who don't have the capacity to consume this stuff, who are doing it because they're told, if you don't do this, you're going to die or your bones are going to rot away. Or now we have places like China, that's traditionally not a dairy consuming country, is now one of the biggest dairy producers in the world. And Western dairy companies are now infiltrating China, trying to open up that new market. That's an act of racial injustice. That's an act of colonial injustice, because these are people who not historically eaten this, and they get sick from it. And we know that we have there's a lot of food-related ailments, medical diseases that come along with dairy consumption. The other thing is that Darren Brown, being this great skeptic, has not stopped to think about who's funding these campaigns. It's the dairy industry that feeds these campaigns. In the United States, the taxpayer money that I paid in my taxes, the government would collect and then hand over to the beef council, the dairy council, so that they could just basically get free advertising from taxpayers. So there's the dairy industry also, and this isn't a secret. You can go on their websites and see, like, this is on their agenda. They want to fund more science. They want to give out more grants. They want to encourage more scientists to prove whatever about how dairy being so wonderful and great. But even like at the very base of this, like common sense, like, why are we the only species on Earth that aren't unweaned? It's really silly if you think about it. It's obviously a cultural construction. So we know that in Ireland, for instance, it was a few thousand years ago that people started to be able to consume this, but humans before that didn't. This is a cultural adaptation as we migrated to colder climates. It's not a necessity. And there's a copious science that shows that this is actually detrimental to our health. And also, when we're talking about non-human animals are completely invisibilized. The experience of non-human animals, we don't even see an image of a cow in this. So it's like this complete kind of removal of non-human animals and their right to life and their right to be free of suffering. And of course, the babies as well that end up in live exports and veal crates. Sam Harris, if folks don't know him, he's a very famous new atheist from the United States. And he's one of the folks who has actually spoken out about extending this rational thinking, reason thinking, and compassion, social justice for other animals. He went vegetarian, but says, oh, he wasn't getting enough protein. I don't know about you. I'm just like sitting here withering away. It's very difficult for me to function, click my mouse because I'm just so low on protein. That's just bunk. It's bunk. Like, It's ridiculous. And it's also, it's like, it's kind of borderline racist to assume if you don't eat meat, then you're going to be protein deficient, because we know historically, like the global majority has not eaten meat or a lot of meat. And so this idea that you don't eat meat, you're lesser than, that actually was used to justify colonization, by the way. You can actually see in some of the writings in British colonizers, why do we colonize people in India? Well, they're rice eaters and they're weak. Why do we colonize people in Ireland? They're potato eaters and they're weak. And we're beef eaters, you know, that famous phrase, we're the beef eaters. So people's diets were actually used to legitimize power relations. And also, I think an interesting thing here is that although he's critical of this idea of faith, and it's all about in the atheist movement, kind of taking control over your own life and looking for research and evidence to make smart decisions, he's still all about that faith. He's like, well, I'm not going to go vegetarian, but we'll leave it up to the great technology gods to sort this out. So instead of just like the clear answer that we have in front of us, just don't eat animals. It's not that hard. Just don't eat them. We don't need to rely on some magical like lab grown stuff to sort that out. Richard Dawkins, who's a very, very famous critical thinker, new atheist from the UK, he also is one person that was kind of on the fence. And there's an interesting interview with him for one of his documentaries with Peter Singer being one of the most famous animal ethicists ever. He's Australian. In the interview, he said, yeah, you're right. It's like, I can't say that you're wrong. You're right. The reasoning is there. I just don't want to do it. And I think that sums up the atheist movement. It's like, I think you might be right, but I just don't want to do it. I like my meat. However, very interestingly, as I was preparing for this, I found out since I dropped out of the New Atheist movement, Richard Dawkins came around. He came around and he's now mostly vegetarian. And he came to it out of his atheist kind of line of thinking. So if I'm just gonna put my money where my mouth is, basically. But also, like Sam Harris, he's still kind of putting faith in technology to sort this problem. And again, I think that's the kind of a natural outgrowth of this evidence-based kind of using science to make decisions in our life and make the world better. That's fine. But I also think that this kind of obsession with scientific advancements detracts from like real approachable solutions that we can have right here, right now. We don't have to think about in the future where they come up with some kind of alternative lab-grown meat or dairy, whatever. So it's still sort of this kind of latching on to faith. And then again, also, I don't know that we really need so much evidence anyway. So again, these are the big thinkers who are telling us we need to look at evidence and science to determine, how, we determine our life choices and how we try to advance society. But at the end, I think, I'm a scientist. I love my science, but like, really, how much evidence do we need? So more research comes out every day about all the sentience of this animal, the sentience of this species. Oh, fish can do this, fish can do that. So do we really need all that evidence to make an informed decision? We've got tons of evidence. We've always had this evidence, but really it's common sense. Any of us who's ever interacted with another animal know that other animals are self-aware and they want to thrive. We don't really need tons and tons of scientific papers to show us that, to inform us on this very important kind of life choice and potential societal restructuring. We don't need all that science to support that. What happens basically is that people are they employ a lot of sociological and psychological measures to resist. There's cognitive dissonance, for instance. There'll be stigmatization of people who care about animal rights. There's a do-gooder derision. That's another psychological thing that we've found. There's tons and tons of research actually coming out of my field in psychology as well, where now it's like we know that animals matter, but why is it that we don't act on that? So I think that actually might be an interesting place for us to look for more scientific research and to engage more of that, is to understand, once we have the answers, once we know that this is an issue, that animals matter and yet we're hurting them, why is it that people don't do anything? I think that's a really important and burgeoning field in sociology and social psychology right now. And there's another thing, as a feminist, I got to shout out this as well. And I'm getting towards the end here, by the way. Again, I'm a scientist. I love my science. I publish in scientific journals. But at the end of the day, I think there's something to be said about, why can't we trust our empathy? Why is it that in the rational movement and the atheist movement, that being emotional having an emotional connection or emotional reaction is something to be denounced. Actually, in psychology, we know that about 80% of our behavioral decisions come from our emotional responses. Why is that a bad thing? Who taught us? Who taught us that trusting your emotional gut, and I guess a way to put it, is a bad thing? Why is it something to stigmatize or deride for me to see an animal suffering and say, that upsets me and I don't think that's right, and I'm upset, I'm angry, or I'm tearful, or whatever it may be? Why isn't that something that could also inform my moral compass? And the feminists have also pushed back on this idea of individualism. I remember I really pushed that at the beginning of the talk, this notion of individualism and personhood and rights and all that sort of thing. Do we really need more of this sort of patriarchal, capitalistic, Western sort of ideas about making the world a better place? Yes, those things have helped us to an extent, but they continue to create divisions. And now it's about like, how can we prove that this group is important enough to be in our club and is worthy of these protections and all that sort of thing? What if we just said we're all community and we have care and compassion for one another? What if we have an ethic of compassion, an ethic of care for each other? Does it really always have to be about advancing rights and focusing on individual personhood? I do think we do, to an extent, need that. But I do also want to give it a shout out. I think that's an important point the ecofeminists have given us, that also it's about community and shared compassion. So this is my last slide now. I just wanted to kind of give a last shout out. Patriarchy, power systems like speciesism, religion. So why can't we align that with non-human animals and challenge this hegemony, which really is what it is, a colonial hegemony, really, of Western animal eating? Can we not just reject the dogma of religion, not just reject the dogma of patriarchy, but also look at how evolutionary science has kind of lost its way in a way, and human supremacy still reigns supreme in our critical thinking, in our humanism, and our atheism? Can we rein that in and challenge that in a way that we purport to do when it comes to religion? So if you want to learn more, here's some books I can recommend. There's Animal Rights and Atheism, a relatively new publication. Dominion is probably the most popular one. It criticizes religion and animal use. One of my books, my first book, actually has a whole chapter on animal rights and atheism. And if you'd like to follow me on social media, I'm everywhere. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, websites, all that good stuff. And if you're interested in my research on animals and Irish society, there it be. So hopefully I didn't go too over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corey. So we already have a hand up from Valerie. Valerie, I'm going to ask you to unmute and say hi.
Hello, Corey. You were just having a look at the HAI website, and I think you said it was a little bit anthropocentric. There is something that you might have overlooked. So the Amsterdam Declaration of Human Rights, which was updated this year in 2022, is also on the HAI website. And basically, I'm not going to go through that all because it's way too long. But point number one is that humanists strive to be ethical. And when you drill down into that, it does say that we recognize that we are part of nature and accept our responsibility for the impact we have on the rest of the natural world. So, because you had mentioned that maybe humanists don't give that much thought to animals or animal rights, but I would kind of disagree with that.
Really?
Yes, I would. And the second thing I just wanted to ask you about, well, first of all, let me say that I completely agree that mankind needs to eat way less meat for lots of different reasons, health, but the burning issue obviously is the environment. Before I did my current job, I actually worked in a vet's office and spent many, many hours on farms doing TB testing. And I had the privilege of, I'm not from a farming community myself, but I met lots and lots of farmers, spent a lot of time. And I have to say that my view would be slightly different than yours, because I didn't see an awful lot of mistreatment of animals. Yes, they were being taken for milk and whatever, but the farmers know if they don't take care of their animals, if their animals are unhappy or unwell, then they are actually going to produce less. And as far as transport of animals is concerned in Ireland anyway, it is and on farms as well, there are lots of checks that are done by the Department of Agriculture. They're subject to inspections. And when animals are being transported, they are subject to a lot of EU legislation. So I would have I wouldn't have the same view of yours. I do want animals to be treated correctly. I am very much interested in animal welfare. But when I have spent time actually on the ground out in farms, I didn't see a lot of abuse, what I would see as abuse going on. And I
care
think
about abuse. I'm really not interested in abuse. I'm about animal
no,
rights.
no. But I mean, even
Liberation.
the cows I saw were happy.
No, well, they probably weren't happy when they hit the slaughterhouse. They probably weren't happy when they were separated from their babies. They probably weren't happy when they're genetically manipulated to produce 10 times more milk than they would in nature. They probably weren't happy when they had mastitis, which a third in Britain have, and probably similar in Ireland as well. I'm sure they weren't happy when they're being used in that way.
Yeah, well, all I can say is that the animals I came across were very.
How long did they live? How long did you allow them to live before you had them killed?
I'm not a farmer. I'm just saying.
How long did the babies get to stay with their mothers before they were put in the?
Depends on the farm you're on.
Sorry?
It depends on the farm you're on.
Okay, because oftentimes in Ireland they just shoot them immediately, or before there's some of them there's not enough room even to send them in live export.
Anyway, they're just my points and just points of
disagreement.
disagreement.
Animal welfare is not my, I don't do animal welfare. I do animal rights. I'm completely opposed to using animals at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for your commentary. So we have Gary. Gary, hi. Would you like to unmute yourself? And
yeah, thanks very much. Can you hear me up?
Yeah, go ahead. Hey.
Thanks, Corey, for the interesting talk. From my perspective, okay, let me just tell you, I come from a council estate, a housing estate in Tipperary, and up until 3 years ago, more or less, I would consider myself to be quite somewhat well read, but I never had any great interest because I was disconnected, completely disconnected, living in a somewhat urban environment, and I've always lived in urban environments. Then when I started running more, and I started running on the countryside more, and I started to actually see the animals in their natural habitat somewhat. So yeah, and then you realize how it's going to end for them. Then for me, there's a moral question that maybe I always wanted to avoid, but I realized there was a moral question to actually ask. If I'm a serious, rational thinking person, I had to ask myself the moral question about whether I really want to support what happens to that. Like, to give you an example, like I was out running one day, and 4 or 5 cattle started running beside me. It was absolutely the most incredible experience, you know. It was like we were joining up together, you know, and it was just amazing. That's happened to me on a few occasions. It was getting back out there, connecting with nature, triggered the question. And as a result now, I mean, I happily debate with anybody in terms of, like, if you're a serious, rational thinking person, you have to actually, first of all, acknowledge the hypocrisy of it. The sheer hypocrisy. We don't need to eat these animals anymore. We simply don't need to do it. And that's really where I am. Then today, on the front page of the Irish Independent, there's a picture, probably one of the most cynical pictures I think I've ever seen. It was a picture of a minister, I don't know who he is, he's the Minister of Agriculture or somebody, and the IFA president, Corey. IFA is Irish Farmers Association. And a picture of 2 happy, smiling children, everyone's happy, and they're talking about having a live crib on St. Stephen's Day here in Dublin. There was some controversy over this crib about using live animals. It's a tradition, it's been a tradition for years. It was cancelled up until Christmas, but here you have the vested interest of the IFA president. You have a minister who basically probably come from an agricultural background, happily playing along with the charade, and front and center, front of the newspaper. And the subtext here is, "F you, all ye joyless vegans, the children are happy again," you know. that's what you're up against in this country. You're up against massive cultural condition. I said to my friend the last day, he was criticizing the Catholic Church, the last point I make, but he was criticizing the Catholic Church. He's a lapsed Catholic, I'm atheist like myself. And he says, well, I never actually chose Catholicism. I grew into it. And I said, you never chose your dietary habits either. You were conditioned into it. The happy, smiling cow on the carton of milk. So if you really are going to be an autonomous adult, you can recognize that you had no act or part in that decision-making process at all. But now you're an adult. Now you can actually do the research and you can actually come to your own conclusions, which is why I'm a member of the Humanist Association, because that's ultimately what it's about. So for me, that's when you merge rational thinking with animal rights, and there's no going back for me anyway. So just wanted to make that point. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the background there and for the story there with the calf as well. And a friend has just sent me a link to the story you were talking about. But I think that's great. This idea of being autonomous and thinking critically about the food that you put in your body and your community as well. For instance, in the United States, there's a big stereotype about veganism as being just a white people thing. But actually in the United States, the fastest growing community of vegans is African-American folks. And a big part of that is not necessarily animal rights. It's about food justice. It's about a recognition of the food that we eat is imbrued with this legacy of colonialism and slavery, and it's destroying communities. Of course, like diet-related diseases have been wreaking havoc on people of color in the United States for a very long time. They're more likely to be living in food deserts where they don't have access to good, healthy food. And so one of the reasons that the Black community in the United States is taking on veganism is to take back control. And that's something I would love to see in Ireland, because as I explore in the book, and I only had time to briefly mention, the food that people eat in Ireland, it's British colonialism. That's not old Irish, Celtic, pre-colonial, anything. This is a legacy of colonialism. And it would be wonderful to explore, like, what were some of those traditional foods that sustained people before meat and dairy just took over the island.
So I think you termed it as otherization, Kerry, right? That sort of, that we may not think about this, but then we're sending, as you said, animals for export, not thinking of what could happen to them. So it's very interesting. And thank you, Gary, for the commentary. Brilliant. And again to Valerie. We have a comment from Patrick Cassidy. Great talk, Corey, and very thought-provoking. No one would disagree that we should be ethically compelled to care for animal welfare, but animal refers to anything that lives that is not a human being. So how far should our care for animals extend down the food chain?
Oh, down the food chain. I knew somebody would want to go here. Actually, was just in a debate at the British Academy earlier this month on that very question, and it's highly contested. There's some people who claim to be vegan and still eat oysters. I personally would not. There's people who are vegan who say we should start advocating for, and I say vegan because I don't think that's vegan, advocating for industrialized insect farming or something like that. I think that a lot of this we don't have enough science on. But again, as I said in one of my last slides, like, how much science do we really need to make decisions? Because we have alternatives available. I do perfectly fine without eating oysters. I do perfectly fine without eating honey. I have about 4 different kinds of plant-based sweeteners in my cabinet right now: agave nectar, maple syrup, etc. I don't need these foods, so I don't really feel the need to kind of dive deep and start kind of clinging on. I really need my oysters and honey. It's like, why don't we just give them the benefit of a doubt that bees are sentient, that insects are sentient, and that fish are sentient, and that mollusks are sentient, because I get on just fine without them. I think people are a little bit afraid. They're like, how far is this going to go? Should we not swat mosquitoes? It's a way to kind of test the philosophy. But at the end of the day, the bulk of animal suffering when it comes to our food system really is chickens, cows, pigs, sheep, etc. So, I mean, personally, I don't eat any kind of animal. That's just me. And I think that we don't need to, and err on the side of caution.
Brilliant. Michelle, I see your hand is up and you are unmuted. Hello. We can't see you, but hopefully we can hear you. Oh, we can see you now.
Hi, you can see my sort of post-viral adult looking face. I want to thank you very much for Corey, for your presentation. I really support you in absolutely everything that you say. So what I'd like to say about Ireland is I feel that the discourse around animals and farming it's kind of willfully dishonest and delusional, really, you know. We have a great billboards at the moment from, I'm not sure, some vegan group, but one of them says, why are there no school trips to abattoirs? And the thing about it is, it's like double think, because we all know the answer to that, don't we? So basically, in this country, I suppose, the narrative is all around animal welfare, which is a way of saying that, you know, we're going to do things that are abusive and very wrong and that we don't want to see happening. But, you know, we'll try and kind of soften them a bit and we'll make ourselves feel better. So basically, a lot of the stuff that goes on, to me, the kind of delusional narrative or the dishonest narrative is very similar to the, you know, excuses that you find in a lot of the non-humanist religious communities in this country as well. So they're all excuses to make people feel better. So I think that really, if you are going to support a system that is manifestly cruel, then just be honest about it and say that you're aware that it's manifestly cruel, but you think it's natural and you don't mind. But what I object to is this kind of cover up, you know. I mean, the fact of the matter is that male calves in this country, has recently been reported, are just being shot. I mean, maybe not even shot. I don't know how they're being killed, because farmers are not going to waste any money on killing male calves, and they're no good. They're considered disposable. You know, it is all about animals. The idea that farmers love their animals is absolute rubbish. I mean, it's just a delusion, and if people want to believe it, you know, they can, but the facts do not really stack up, you know. I mean, when it comes to egg production, male chicks are just ground up alive. I mean, in this country, if anybody eats pork, or, you know, nearly 100% of pigs are kept in extremely inhumane, and they're extremely sensitive and intelligent animals, you know, indoors, in barns. So there's no real care for the welfare of animals. It really is all about money, and everybody just looks the other way. And I wish people would just admit that. So if you're talking about rights, and if you're talking about all of the sort of there needs to be a call to reason, which I would hope that humanism would have, you know, and human rights, and just look at it honestly, or else admit the cruelty that's there. I mean, farmed animals live a very fraction. Look, you know, if you think about a lamb, they live a very short fraction of the life that they would live in the wild. You know, maybe they live less than a year when they might live 12 years. And calves are taken away to the great distress of cows so that we can have dairy from their mothers, probably in the first few days of their life. The male ones will probably be shot or killed in some way that doesn't cost the farmer anything. You know, sheep are castrated. Male sheep will be castrated without any anesthetic, because why would you pay for an anesthetic? So this is not to convert anyone, but this is just to say to people that we have a really dishonest discourse in this country of nice, happy cows and sheep, and you know, you know, the young calves that sort of are taken from their mothers that are very, like their babies, literally, and put on long sea trips to go to other countries to be slaughtered or to be veal or whatever. So we need to just own up to the fact of what we do. And then if people want to turn around and say, okay, it's very cruel, but I think it's natural, then that's fine. I have no argument with that. So I suppose the point I'm making is that some of the parallels with the kind of justifications, romantic justifications that there are for religious beliefs, seem to me to be the same about the story that we sell ourselves about, you know, happy farmyard animals. It's all about hard business, big business, and it's all about cruelty. We look the other way. So thank you very much for what you said.
Thanks, Michelle, because I didn't, as you noticed, I didn't have time in the talk to talk about some of the actual things that happen. So I think it is important for people who don't know, like, the system itself is full of all kinds of violence, so many forms of it. I do think that Ireland is extremely unique. You're right. Although in the United States and the UK and elsewhere, we get this happy meat kind of thing. I think Ireland is quite unique because Ireland, its stake in the global economy is Irish food, and Irish food has been very romanticized with these rolling hills and fresh grass.
100%. And it's all very polluting and cruel.
Thank you, Michelle. Just some other comments. I know, Gary, you got your hand up again, so keen to get you back in quickly. We'll wrap up soon enough. Just from Billy, absolutely 100% agree with everything you said. Vegan and plant-based for 6 years. Delighted to hear someone come on and speak on this, and I've despaired at the double standards of the humanist philosophy. And then Derek, whilst plants are sentient in the way animals are, there's some scientific research to show plants can feel pain and are aware. So is being vegan just a matter of degrees? I mean, I think we could spend all night looking at all the different levels and layers. But thank you for that, Derek. Gary, would you like to come back in? And we will look to wrap up fairly soon. Unless you have anybody else who has a question, please raise your hand.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to come back in quickly on the last speaker's point there. I said to a friend of mine from a farming background that he lost his uncle by suicide a few years ago. He was a lifelong farmer. And I said to myself, do you think there might be a connection? Or is there any research done? Because most farmers are not, Nazis in disguise or evil people. There must be an emotional and a psychological consequence of raising an animal from birth, taking care, looking after them, and then bringing them to their death. There has to be some, sense of, you have to disassociate yourself from the product, from the end product, for purely economical reasons. I've always thought that there might be a connection there.
Gary, thank you so much for bringing that up as well, because I think it's absolutely important that we talk about farmers' rights as well. So even if you're watching this talk and you do not care about animals, which is unfortunate, and if you care about people, what's happening to Irish farmers right now is that, yes, there is research, by the way, Gary, sorry, Keely wants to leave now. There is research, by the way, that there are psychological consequences. There's fascinating research that, for instance, in the United States, that once slaughterhouses come to town, some sociologists looked at the crime rates. And in fact, one form of crime immediately rose very, very high after a slaughterhouse came to town. And they measured this across the country, and that was rape. And we know that there's a spillover effect, societal violence, when people are they're traumatized doing this for a living. But beyond the psychological effects, animal agriculture is economically unviable, and it's only kept up. The EU props it up. And in the United States, taxpayers prop it up. It doesn't make money. And we know in Ireland that this long tradition of family farming, that's out the window. And so a major reason that you have a lot of mental health crises in the Irish farming community is because it's an economy in crisis, and it's not sustainable in the future. And so this is one of the things I think Michelle mentioned, those billboards, the Go Vegan World billboards. I think Sandra Higgins does a wonderful job talking about how we need to be thinking about farmers' welfare as well. The EU, Ireland, the government of Ireland needs to be now starting to support farmers and sustainable plant-based agriculture. We are starting to see that. I have seen in recent reports from Board Bia that they're now recognizing how the oat industry is going to be the future. It's much, much, much more sustainable. It requires much less land and much less water. So if you don't care about animals at all, and you care about human rights, if you care about Irish farmers, we need to be thinking about moving away from animal agriculture. I'm so glad you brought that up, Gary.
Thanks, Karen. I think you mentioned, Corey, that maybe years ago veganism was seen as like a sideshow or like a threat to the economy, but the objective is to bring it more to the fore, that it can be seen as part of everything that we do day to day, as Gary's been saying. Mary, I'll give you the final question, and then we'll give the final word to Corey, if that's okay. Mary, say hi, and brilliant, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'll keep this very brief because I don't agree with veganism at all. I see it as a cult, and I think it's very damaging to children. And we haven't talked much from the nutrition point of view. I think Ireland is a wonderful country to live in with regard to our fabulous meat industry and dairy. And I think there's a great carnivore movement now. There's a great animal-based movement. People are beginning to understand how important, from a nutritional point of view, meat is and has always been. It's an ancestral way to eat. So I do thank you very much for your presentation and found it interesting, but I'm totally on
I
the
encourage you to look at some
side.
research. I encourage you to pick up my book and look at the research that I've explored there. It's not ancestral. Meat eating was not a major part of Irish diet. The archaeology shows that. And if you want to say that meat and dairy is essential to the human diet, it's not the human diet, it's white people's diet. So we need to be very careful about that. This is a much more recent cultural adaptation. I've lived happily as a vegan for 22 years and I'm perfectly happy, healthy. And I can wake up every morning knowing that no animal died for me. And that's really what this is all about, is social justice. But thanks for offering a counterpoint there. I appreciate that, Mary.
Corey, so thanks. So we'll leave you with the final word if you want, just as a little summary, and then I'll conclude.
Well, I just in a nutshell would say, first off, thank you very much for having me. I know it's a deeply controversial topic, especially in Irish society. So I'm very, very honored to have platform today. And for folks who are not thought about this before, I encourage you to keep a skeptical mind and an open mind and read more into this. And I think, honestly, at the end of the day, like veganism, there is research that shows it's not just a healthy diet, it's the optimally healthy diet, and it will be the diet of the future. And what we do to non-human animals is also absolutely unsustainable when we're looking at climate change. But more importantly, if we take the principles of social justice seriously, we can't exploit animals anymore. End of. Non-human animals matter just like humans matter, and we owe them. It's a moral obligation to them to stop exploiting them, eating them, wearing them, using them, etc. So thanks very much. I appreciate it. This has been an excellent opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. And just a thank you to everybody. I mean, I see final comment from Claire. Fully agree with everything Corey said. Another vegan atheist here. And thanks for the lively discussion. So just from my side, thank you for everybody joining this evening. I really enjoyed these talks, and particularly tonight. I also, when talking to Corey, learned about a famous swimmer, Jack McClown from Belfast. So I have a strong interest in that arena, and will be, it's great to have these types of connections, right, with all the topics we're talking about. So we will be aiming to post the evening's talk on our social media. We'll also have a summary of the talk for those who couldn't attend. If you want to share that onto friends and those interested. And obviously, if you want to learn more about humanism and all we talked about this evening, and the wording of humanism, I think I've certainly got that to ponder about humanism being the terminology. I think there's certainly depth in understanding that, and maybe being a little bit more cognizant of everything that links to what we're supposed to be and feel. So again, thank you so much to everybody for attending. Thanks to Corey and her cat and dog as well for joining in, and to Gary and Michelle and all the questions we had and participation. Brilliant. We really appreciate that. This is what makes these talks happen, and obviously everybody else has come. So we wish you a nice rest of evening, and hopefully see you again for our next talk, and have a wonderful festive period. So thank you again to everybody. Good night.